Our next speaker was Australia's longest-serving Sex Discrimination Commissioner, where she worked tirelessly to promote gender equality. She founded the Champions of Change Coalition and has led major cultural reviews into leading national institutions. In 2016, she was appointed an Officer of the Order of Australia and was named 2016 New South Wales Australian of the Year. Please join me in welcoming Chair-Rapporteur of the United Nations Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls, the delightful Liz Broderick.
Your Excellencies, Minister Payne, Grace Tame and Yasmin Paul, I'm so thankful that all Australians will get to hear your words. I defy anyone across this land to hear your stories and not be moved by them to strong action on gender equality. So thank you. Thank you, Grace and Yasmin. As I stand on this stage today, I'm actually having a bit of a flashback. I'm flashing back to about 3 years ago when I was asked to deliver the Australian oration right here at the International Convention Centre. And I'd fortunately asked my identical twin sister to become my +1. Could she join me at the big event? So I crawled out of a taxi and I'm walking through the taffeta and champagne. I spot Jane right over there on the edge, and she comes running up to me. She says, "Look, you're not looking very well, Liz." I said, "To be honest, I'm not feeling that well. I don't know whether this keynote speaker will be keynoting anytime soon." And Jane from over in 60, I said, "Here you are. I've written out my speech. You have to deliver it." So she went from 60 to table 1 beside Gladys Berejiklian for a half-hour conversation, and then she walked up those stairs and she stood on this podium and delivered my address. And I have to say, she got a standing ovation. I was watching on the webcast at home. Thank you very much. She said the last time she'd done that for me was when she did the Year 9 science exam. And I came second in the class, thank you very much. But how the world's changed since Jane was on this platform, particularly in terms of action on gender equality. And I think we can all agree today that the inequalities faced by women prior to the pandemic have now become exacerbated. And there is an urgent need. We've heard so much from our previous speakers for everyone to play their part. And I was thinking about that, and I think urgent needs require urgent funding. So I do encourage you to give generously to UN Women today, because I have witnessed firsthand across every region of the world the work of UN Women. I can tell you that when no one else cares, UN Women is always there. Just 3 years ago, I was appointed by the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva as their Chair-Rapporteur, an independent expert on discrimination against women and girls. My role requires me to undertake country missions on behalf of the United Nations and to draw to the attention of nation states human rights violations against women and girls. And as for so many of you, I'm sure, I came into my new role wondering if I had what it takes. I was trepidatious. I was not knowing, would I be good enough? But absolutely prepared to give it my all. And I have to tell you, I have learnt so much, mostly through listening closely to the stories of women. Everyday women learning from their wisdom, learning from their resilience. And some of those stories have really hit hard over the last few weeks. I'm thinking of the more than 3,000 direct testimonies from young women alleging sexual assault and harassment at the hands of their fellow male students. I'm thinking of a young woman in Parliament so excited to be starting out on their career, who must live in silence, never questioning a culture that allows sexual assault to flourish, accepting that silence is a precondition for promotion. And I can't tell you just how happy I am that Kate Jenkins has been appointed, my successor, has been appointed to lead an independent review into the culture in the Parliament. And I stand ready to assist in any way. I'm thinking of the woman that I met just a few weeks ago who told me she sits in her car each morning outside her workplace, shaking, unable to take the few steps to her office for fear of a toxic culture that allows her to continue to be bullied, harassed, and excluded every day. And I'm asking myself, why is it that so many women can never be safe in their place of education or work? I'm thinking of all the women across Australia who've carried the lion's share of care at schools, as schools and childcare centres have closed, as elderly parents need more support, with everyone locked down in the family home, and for many women, the fear of increased violence at the hands of their intimate partner. I'm thinking of those women in precarious work who've lost their jobs, of Indigenous women, migrant women, women with disabilities, and I'm asking myself, why is it that women must suffer more during this global pandemic? And I'm also thinking of all the women I've met in other countries, women and girls, of the mothers that I meet in African nations who are pulling their daughters out of school because fetching firewood and water for a family takes so much longer without basic infrastructure. And it will only get worse with changing climate. So why is it that women and girls are paying the price of poverty and climate change? And I'm thinking of the feminist policymakers I meet in Latin America and Eastern Europe who can no longer use the term gender in official policy documents. Why is it that in 2021 the term gender remains so controversial? Or the young girl raped in North America who, because of new restrictive legislation introduced as a response to the pandemic, will no longer have access to abortion, and any doctor who offers to assist will now risk imprisonment. Or just last month, the women's rights activist who was arrested in Poland for campaigning for abortion reform. Why is it that we can't offer basic access to safe abortion as a human right? The fact that these inequalities and violations persist today is bewildering. Women's stories, and we've heard so many incredible women's stories here today, they demand change, they demand transformation. They demand us to challenge the status quo. We must bring the private sphere which women inhabit, into the public domain and create shared accountability for change. Because it is the lived experience of inequality, of exclusion, of hardship, that's what matters. It's women's stories that are calling us to action. Discrimination lies at the heart of every one of these stories. It's an issue faced by women regardless of their identity or status. It operates systematically in all spheres of women's lives, and it's by no means accidental. Discrimination is indeed political, and it happens by design. Structural discrimination, which exists in the public and the private realms, reflects an underlying power imbalance intended to suppress women and relegate them to an inferior status, whether through what may be perceived as an innocuous denial of certain rights, to harmful stigma and marginalisation, to extreme forms of violence and femicide. Who you are and where you sit in the world determines your access to resources and power. Women with less power, those that are more marginalised, will be impacted to a much greater degree. 2 years ago, my UN mandate released a global thematic report examining the growing backlash on women's rights across the world. Of all our reports, it has been the most cited across the UN system, because our country visits reveal an unprecedented pushback across all regions of the world on women's rights by an alliance of ultra-conservative ideologies and religious fundamentalists. This anti-gender movement has as its focus the so-called protection of the family, protection of culture, of religion, of tradition. Strong men politics has spread across different regions of the world. Yet during COVID, as we've said before, it's women leaders who have stood out for their effective leadership based on listening to evidence, care, and inclusion. So today, as we sit here in the middle of a global pandemic with inequality deepening, we stand at a crossroads with the very concept of gender equality and women's rights increasingly contested. But we also stand at a place of new opportunity. For as well as those resisting equality across all regions of the globe, we're also witnessing new and creative forms of civic participation and action. That activism, as we have seen today, is led by young people and particularly young women and girls. So from women's marches to the Me Too and Black Lives Matter social movements, leading civil society organisations are evolving, and they're evolving with young women at the helm. I think it's striking that young women are increasingly active at the intersections of inequalities. For example, race and gender, or LGBTIQ and disability. Young women are striving not only to advance human rights of women and girls, but they're seeing these rights as inextricable from ending other forms of discrimination, other forms of exclusion and injustice. And I'm so excited because we're seeing them catalyse new movements that have swept the globe in calling for equality, democracy, economic and climate justice. They're linking issues such as violence against women to other movements, including women's rights and reproductive rights. We've seen them flooding the streets, the airwaves and the internet, bringing with them incredible energy and testimonials, bringing to light truths that are too often buried in darkness. What we are seeing right here in Australia, right here, right now, is absolutely part of that picture. Young women speaking truth to power, calling for accountability and action, and achieving victories for the protection of their communities and the world we all share. So on my journey, as I travel to different regions of the world, although of course in the last year I haven't been doing much travelling, but what I see is young women's growing activism, and it's a shining light in an otherwise dimming world. And that's why reaching out and building alliances and solidarity across the different generations, between young and old, women and men, that's what's vital for our continued progress and success. So what have I learned in my journey that I can share with you today? Firstly, I've learned that discrimination impacts different women differently. Systems of power and privilege are deeply embedded in every aspect of our lives, and so often they're invisible. And they're particularly invisible to those who are privileged. For those with power and privilege, equality can seem like oppression. So I have learnt that in any conversation about gender equality, I need always to be listening and reflecting on who is benefiting, who is losing, and who is invisible. Second thing I've learned is that you don't have to be extraordinary to create change. I'm certainly not. Our colleague Amy Haddad, she recently wrote in her article, Reclaiming the Ordinary, as an act of feminist resistance, which I love as a title. She said, it's the relentless championship of ordinary people for themselves and for others that brings change. Changing the world is about doing what you can when you can. It's about the accumulation of small, ordinary actions, adding to, adding more, continuing. Change doesn't happen in one giant leap. It happens when decent women and men take small actions across the world to tell their stories and hold nations and other institutions accountable for their treatment of women and girls. And thirdly, I've learnt that the progress that I see today came about because women I will never know, they cared enough to stand tall. They cared enough to demand change in order that future generations of women and girls could live more empowered lives. Yasmin talked about the importance of roots, about connecting to those who come before us. I couldn't agree more. I use the stories of those who've come before me to give me courage to fuel a global systemic response. And finally, to my fellow change agents, every one of you here in the room, I've learnt the importance of self-care, and I really sense it today. Because over the years, I've often talked about self-care, but words are cheap. It's the actions we take which speak volumes about who we are. Caring for oneself is never a selfish act. It is the stewardship of the gift we were put on the earth to offer others. So it must be a priority, because how you turn up, how you bear witness to what's happening in this moment matters. Being well, both physically and mentally, is the ultimate act of women's empowerment. And we will be well. And in many countries I see it is the ultimate act of political defiance. Recognising that you are just one part of a strong movement of change, connected to other humans who also care deeply. That's the key. As one beautiful human rights defender told me in Ethiopia, she said, "Look, Liz, you do your part and know that I will do mine." Because every one of us, men, women, particularly those with power, we have a responsibility to speak, to use our power and influence to drive change, to celebrate women's achievements equally with men's, to demand our equal place in nations. So what can we do? Well, if you're a parent or a carer, I absolutely believe that human rights starts at home. Respect and equality starts at home. You shape the expectations of your daughters, the attitudes of your sons, the children in your care. What you model, whether as a couple of opposite or same sex, or indeed as a sole parent or carer, what we model our children will take into their adult lives. And if you lead in business or in your organisation, and those with power, call out sexism and disrespect when you see it. Enable men to access flexible work as a fundamental, not as a favour. And never allow a woman's pregnancy to jeopardise her place at work. We must build a culture within organisations where dignity and respect lies at the core. And to all men, so many beautiful fellow change agents with us in the room today, step up beside us as allies, not only because you love your partners, your daughters, your mothers and sisters, but because you're committed to creating a gender-equal world with us, where power, resources and opportunities are distributed equally. 25 years on from the 4th Women's World Conference held in Beijing, accountability for progress can't sit on the shoulders of women alone. Women and girls need men and boys as allies to stand with us, to take action and equal accountability for change. And then finally, to every woman who has led the way, every one of you in the room today who has gone above and beyond, and there are so many of you, I stand in awe of what you have done and what you continue to do. I am able to keep on showing up because of the outstanding support and deep connections I have with so many of you. So thank you. You are the reason I continue to do my work across the world. Thank you.